Last-minute shake-up at 5:30 a.m., laundry situation not good. And when your focus is on helping your clients, it's easy to forget about yourself. But NASM knows trainers.
Morning, Ryan. It's okay.
And staying in front of the day isn't always as
Thanks,
simple
Ryan.
as 1,
What's
2,
up?
3. So when the unexpected has you pressing pause,
What's the latest on creatine?
I'm going to get back to you on that.
let NASM 1 help you press play. Visit NASM.org to sign up for a membership today.
Well, hello there, listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of the Marcom award-winning Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, wellness coach, and well-being expert, Darlene Marshall, and I have a little confession. I love a good confession at the top of the show. I've been thinking a lot about storytelling lately, and that is partly because for a good chunk of my adult life, I have been one of those like overly analytical people that thinks that if I could just find the right science and I can just teach you the right science, then you're going to do the things that are going to be to your betterment, which unquestionably as a trainer kept me a bit limited in my ability to effectively help people because, well, for a few reasons. First off, if I'm going to point to some science about why something is effective or true, there has to be research into that thing. Earlier this week, I came across some new emerging research in concussion and brain injury protocols. Turns out, that thing in a movie where someone hits their head really hard and then they shake their head and they look kind of dazed? Yeah, that's not currently in our concussion criteria, even though anybody who's ever had a concussion knows that thing where you kind of shake your head and you feel dazed and your eyes can't focus. I've had quite a few when I was playing rugby. Well, if science doesn't recognize a phenomenon, that means that they can't measure it. But also, if we don't have the way in which to qualify something about the human experience, how could science measure it? Which studying well-being and being a well-being expert, there are lots of aspects of what is the best of life and living that we don't actually know how to measure yet. We know it's important. We can see that it's important to the well-being data, to the life satisfaction data, but we don't know how to qualify it. So we don't know how to measure it. And that had me thinking about how do we talk about these things that are no less real, but they're not necessarily as measurable as science would like them to be. Now, you might have noticed, if you've been a fan of the show for a while, that we've had a few guests on this year that weren't researchers. They weren't wellness experts, but they have incredible stories that illustrate how something that we think of as fitness or wellness or self-care have led to these big ripple effects in their lives. And today's guest is one of those incredible stories. In addition to my confession, I'm also confessed to being a massive podcast nerd. And one of the podcasts that I am absolutely obsessed with is the podcast, Was I in a Cult? You people out there, and all your murder shows, you keep them, because I'm going to be nerding out on all the cult shows. And that one is definitely my favorite. There's a lot in the whole story of our guest today that we're not going to get to. And so if you find her story interesting and compelling, if you're into cult stories, if you think that stuff's interesting, you should go check it out. It's from June of earlier this year. But what struck me in today's guest story is the role that fitness plays, the transformative role. And if you've heard me tell my story, you know that fitness was pretty transformative in the arc of my life too. I don't want to say any more than that. I don't want to spoil it. I want our guest to tell us about her life and her story herself. So Ashleigh Teeter is the owner of the Starlit Running Company. She's the host of the Cult Next Door podcast, which I haven't checked out yet, Ashleigh, but it's on my list, and is currently pursuing a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. She is so much more than those titles. I can't wait for you to hear her. Ashleigh, welcome to Better Than Fine, and thank you so much for your time.
Hi, thank you so much. First of all, I have to say I'm super impressed with you because you're doing a live show. My podcast is very edited. If we mess up, we just go back and take that out. So props to you.
Yeah, we mess up and let it stand here. We definitely do mess up sometimes. But also, for the first 2 years of the show, we did it recorded and we edited it. But then I had this great opportunity to join the NASM Podcast Network. Shout out to Eric, who is producing the show. And it gave us the capability to do it like this. So I feel very fortunate. And also shout out to those listening on the recording. We live stream at 4 p.m. Eastern time on the NASM YouTube channel. And so if you ever want to catch us live and ask your questions in real time, we would love to hear you. And shout out to the people in chat right now. So I've set it up. Let's knock it down. Can you tell our listeners a bit about your early life and set the stage for us in your story? I know there's a lot to it, so I'm asking you a big question, but bring us into your world.
Yeah. So when I was about 3, that's starting pretty early, 3 or 4, my parents came into a cult called the Worldwide Church of God. And that cult was headed up by Herbert Armstrong. It was a very high control religion where, like most cults, they're set up very patriarchal, where you have, I know a lot of people would probably be familiar with this, especially you if you've listened to a lot of cult podcasts, but that umbrella where it's like, that's God, then it's the husband, then it's the wife, then it's the children, and so and as women in that structure, in that environment, your job is just pretty much in service to the men in your life. And so my dad brought us into that religion. So that's really all I've ever known. And so I grew up in that environment where I saw my mom being the recipient of a lot of abuses, as a lot of the women in that church were. And my dad specifically was extremely controlling. The church did encourage all of the men to have strict control of their households. And so in a sense, I've always said they're like mini cult leaders, that the church was breeding. But my dad was just next level on that. And it wasn't until, I was well into adulthood that I realized, he's a malignant narcissist. And that explains all of these experiences and why my childhood was the way that it was. So very, very strictly controlled in my home environment, and then also in the broader sense of the church environment. And as a woman, your ambition is to get married and to have a family and to be a mom and a housewife. And I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting that. But this was like, if you're a woman, there is no choice. That is what you're doing. You're not considering a career or like how you might want to impact the world. Like your whole entire focus is, I've got to find a husband so that I can take care of my husband and be his, helpmeet. And so I got married to the first person I dated. I guess I was 21. And he was in the church, and he was born in it. So we were both completely indoctrinated into that lifestyle. And we were married for a long time, and we had 3 children. And at some point, I think it was after my second child was born that I just really felt like, I love my children, but there's got to be something more than this day in and day out. I didn't feel like my strengths and, what I had to offer was really ever going to be put to use. Like I was never going to be able to explore that. And
Gifts.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, your gifts that you
Yeah.
had gifts that weren't being fully utilized in the expectations and the path that you were given by, we obviously we all come from a culture of origin, right? And that's going to condition us to certain beliefs and certain outcomes. And you use the phrase, and I want to parrot it for the listeners if they're not familiar with cult dynamics, is like high control groups, right? Because the things that we think of as cults are like Jonestown.
That's right.
But there are lots of examples. And one of the things I love about some of the cult shows that are out there is there are lots of examples of high control groups. And really what it is that it removes agency, right? It removes our sense of choice about what our future can be because we're told what our future has to be.
Absolutely.
And thank you. Thank you from the beginning. I know I said thank you when I brought you in at the top of the show, but sharing it in the way you do requires a lot of vulnerability. And I, having listened to other interviews of yours, I know that your willingness to tell some really difficult things about your story is what allows other people to hear the power of what comes next. So you're into your adulthood, you've bought into this path, and then come to this moment of realizing, oh, I have something in me that needs something else. I think that unless people have really looked into this world, the quick blush of imagination doesn't lend itself to some of the stuff that we're talking about. So one of the things that I think people can really take for granted is access to something like sports and movement. Can you just speak to a little bit the lack of that? Because I've heard you mention it in other platforms. I think it's so important when we talk about what comes next and what it gave you.
Yeah. I always was drawn to sports. I was allowed. My parents homeschooled me for a very short time, and it did not go well. I don't think they really had the tools to do that, and so I'm the oldest of 5, and I was the only child to actually go through high school and graduate high school. By the time my other siblings came along, they had pulled them out of school. And so they did not have any of those opportunities. I was allowed to play sports in school, but because we were a Sabbath keeping organization, which means, we could not participate in anything. I mean, no sports, no TV, no shopping. Like we are inside in our home Friday night sunset to Saturday night sunset. That pretty much eliminated my ability to actually participate in a meaningful way in any of the sports that I was involved in. So I could go to practice, but no one was going to let me dress out or play in a basketball game or volleyball game because I can't ever be there on Friday night or Saturday. And so that was definitely limiting. And growing up, I thought I thought that sacrifice was meaningful, to God, and I'm the only one here that's doing the right thing and that's really obeying God, because that's what we were taught, that it was going to take sacrifices, that it's the whole thing of you sacrifice your happiness and your well-being and your ambitions and everything now for something in the future. And that future thing is after you're dead. You know what I mean? It's like, it's like just this life is just what we have to get through to get to the good part, and that just, I thought, I'm making these sacrifices for that reason. And so, yeah, my access to sports was definitely limited, because I would have loved to have participated in a bigger way. And running is something that you can do anytime, pretty much anywhere. And so running was something that I latched on to around middle school or so, because I realized, I can go and do that on my own around my neighborhood, or I can drive to the local school track and do that on a Sunday. And so that was a really important outlet for me as far as, physical fitness and like being involved in that.
You're listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall. My guest is Ashleigh Teeter, and we're talking about her journey of running back to herself. And you brought up the R word, so let's open that door.
Yeah.
So you've set this stage for us of early adulthood, a couple of kids. You're still in the cult at this point, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And in this hierarchy of, there's God, there's the cult leader, and then each household is kind of its own mini cult with the husband at the head of household. But you knew from this time in middle school and high school that movement did something for you. Where does the running step in and take us with you on the evolution of that in your life?
Yeah. And it definitely was important to me. I just didn't have like the movement. I didn't have the vocabulary to explain what that was. But looking back, I feel like it was in a way a coping mechanism, and a healthy one for me to be able to process the high control, especially being like the firstborn, which means I was kind of parentified in a way, and so I did take on a lot of responsibility, and you've got to figure out ways to cope in situations like that. And I'm really thankful that I found running. So after my daughter, my second child, was born, I was just really struggling, and it got to a point where I just thought maybe I need to be on an antidepressant, because, it's depression is tricky. You can look around and like logically say, there's no reason why I should be depressed. I have these two beautiful children, and but still I'm like crying every morning when I wake up, and so I went to my doctor, and she asked me, she said, are you doing anything for yourself? And I was like, no, like definitely not. I'm, got a newborn and a toddler and a husband, and, I was responsible for everything. And that was the other part, is that, even though my husband was not as controlling as other husbands and as my dad was, he still fully thought, taking care of the kids in the house was 100% my responsibility. And so I didn't ever feel like I had help at home. And that was really difficult. And I thought I was failing because I needed something else. I just thought, why is this so much harder by myself?
Yeah. You speak to something really important there that hadn't occurred to me before, which now I feel a little silly that it hadn't occurred to me before, which is when we're in a dynamic where we're told to be a certain way, right? Yeah, I've never tried to put this into words before. I've definitely felt it. Like I grew up in a rural Christian environment that I did not fit the template of what female looks like in this culture. When you don't fit, like when you're not happy, when you force yourself to fit it, you wonder, what is wrong with me?
Always.
Like, why am I broken? That this thing that I'm told is what I'm supposed to be does not validate me at all.
Absolutely. And I think that's the danger of the cult in that type of environment.
Or any culture that prescribes like a way we have to be, right? Whether we're talking about cults, or we're talking about being queer, or we're talking about being, the wrong color or the wrong whatever, right?
Absolutely.
That I think that is the problem with that kind of rigid social toxic masculinity, right? Just being a man who isn't manly enough for whatever context they find themselves in.
Exactly.
Right. And we're talking about degrees of severity here. Like obviously in a high control group, in a cultic environment, that the repercussions are way higher, but the self-rejection hurts, right? Either at any scale there. Yeah. Thank you you just clicked something in my mind. I appreciate that a lot. So from that place, you're talking to the doctor, she's asking if you do anything for yourself. I think I know the answer, but
Yeah.
what'd you start doing for yourself? Tell me the
No,
show.
yeah. And she said, "Well, what do you like to do?" And running was the first thing that popped into my head. And I'm like, "Running?" And she goes, "Well, are you running at all?" And I said, "No, not any." And we had a treadmill. And I mean, my daughter was, just a few months old. And so it was kind of difficult to get out of the house. But I left there and I told her I will start running. We didn't try meds or anything at that point. I'm like, I'll try to incorporate this into my life. And I was very serious about it. And so I started running every day. And I did have to start out, with like a mile before I could work myself back up to where I had been previously. And I just felt, and I still feel this when I run. It's even in the first few minutes, I just feel alive. I don't know any other way to put it, but I feel like I just feel joy. And I felt that. And it was not very long. I mean, I'm probably in the first couple of weeks, I just started kind of dreaming about, what else could I do? Like, I'm loving this running. What if I run a marathon? And then, there's part of me that's like, Ashleigh, that's crazy. Like, you're running 2 miles at a time right now. But I got off the treadmill when I was done and I Googled, I looked up marathons and I found all these training schedules and I just picked one. It was like there was a build your base one that gets you up to 25 miles a week, and then there was another one, and I just downloaded both of them. I just started.
Write it down.
And this is like before I mentioned this to anyone else. I'm like, I'm gonna build my base, And I suddenly had like purpose and I was getting excited and the depression left. And I know it's not always that easy because I've had other times in my life where running didn't touch it.
Well, you touched on something a second ago, and I want to catch this gem for our listener. But first, you're listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall. My guest is Ashleigh Teeter, who is sharing our incredible story with us of her running to herself. And the word that you said that I think is so essential when you said like, well, I know it doesn't work this way for everybody, and I've had times it didn't work for me, is within a few moments of beginning running, you feel joy. And I'm going to interject with some positive psychology here for a second, because it's a positive psychology podcast. Joy specifically is in our positive emotional response is about exploration and possibility. So negative emotions narrow us, and it's called a specific thought action tendency. So like fear, flee, anger, posture. The positive emotions open us up, and joy specifically is about like exploring your environment, exploring new relationships, exploring possibility, dreaming. And so I think it's so, yes, exactly. And I think it's so fascinating that for you around this thing where you had, and this was the moment in your story where I was like, oh my God, I have to have this woman on my show. That you'd had this experience of being so limited in what you were allowed to do and what you were allowed to think about yourself. And it was the act of running that opened that aperture in a way that nobody could stop.
Yeah, that's right.
Will you tell us about the first marathon story?
Yeah, about asking my husband.
Yes. Oh goodness! Listen, I listened to that part twice because I was just like,
no.
I have a story. I have a story to tell you in response, but please.
Yeah. So I knew this was going to be a bit of a challenge because, marathon training takes a lot of time. It's a time commitment, and you have to really want it to commit that amount of time. And I did really want it. And so when you really want something, you are just thinking of all the ways you're going to remove the barriers and push the boundaries, and how are you going to make this work? And I had thought through every single angle, and it took me a bit to work up my courage to talk to him about it. And it's not that I I don't want to paint a picture of him being like this harsh, gruff, like he's going to yell at me. He had the power to just say no. He had the power to say, this isn't going to work for our family. Like, you can't take care of the children and do this. And so that's how I approached it, with answers to all of those questions and all of those concerns. And I'm just like, shaking over this, because I felt like if he doesn't say yes, like, I will be leveled. Like, I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to recover from this, because I wanted it so bad. And I went to him and I made my pitch, and, he was, he had a lot of questions, and it was just like, well, how are you going to do this? And dinner and grocery store, and the baby is a baby, like, how are you going to run for 20 something miles at a time? And who's watching the children? This kind of thing. I had my treadmill, and I'm like, I will get up at 4 a.m. and do this, or whatever time I have to do, or after they're in bed. Like, I promised him, this is not going to affect you in any way. Our life is going to be exactly the same. Like, dinner will be done. The kids will be taken care of. You will not have to watch the kids when I go run. And he said he would think about it. And I was just like, I was probably praying at that point, like, please, let him say yes. And I also told him, part of my bargaining was, I will only do this once. Like, I just want to run a marathon. It's a bucket list. Like, who would want to do this more than once? And I'm like, just one time. And he said, okay, eventually.
Yeah, you got him there.
Yeah.
So the story that came to mind for me as you were describing this the first time I heard your story,
Yeah.
I'm trying to describe to people, when you grow up a different way than people think of growing up,
Mm-hmm.
and you're trying to acclimate them to your culture. I grew up, as I mentioned, rural poor, in the church,
Mm-hmm.
not in a cult, but
Mm-hmm.
definitely a certain amount of control in terms of what you were and weren't allowed to do. And my mom, who is now, multiple master's degrees, a very successful woman, but she has a story about being, I think she was 20 when this happened. She'd been working. She had one child already, my eldest sibling. Went to all of the men in the family who were sitting around my grandparents' kitchen table and served them lunch, and had to convince the men that she should be allowed to buy a car with her own money, because she was not allowed to make that decision. And voting in our family for generations, like generations now, but since women have had the right to vote, there are 2 generations of my family, their votes were controlled by their husbands. Like, I think it's really difficult for people who grow up a certain kind of way to understand that when you are told this is the way it is, breaking out of that mold is very difficult because of all of the things you have to let yourself realize.
Right.
And for you, that realization was happening like with Miles. And that's what I think is so incredible about your story.
Yeah. Yeah, it really was. And I didn't know how powerful it would be either.
Yeah, that's the thing that I've been trying to find the language to describe this phenomenon of, if you don't know that this thing we're talking around, right? Like movement and joy, and that evolving and transforming your life is a felt experience instead of an intellectual one. If you don't understand that, it's really difficult to put it into words in a way that would convince people otherwise. And that's the whole point of the storytelling that I was talking about at the top of the show, is that there's something about the experience of letting yourself try and letting yourself feel that changes who you are along the way.
Yeah. It's
I don't know
just
if you
hard
want
to
to
get
speak to that.
it's just hard to get to step 1 sometimes, if you really have been conditioned for so many years, or even since, you're too little to remember, that your worth is only in this one thing, and that you really aren't deserving of exploring your passions and your interests. And so there's even that hurdle of, should I even be asking for this thing that I want?
Am I
But
allowed?
yeah. But like the men are never asking in these situations, the men are never asking these questions ever.
Not in these situations. I will say after, I've been 13 years in this industry. I've worked with people of all
Yeah.
stripes and colors and gender and sexual identities. And in these situations, no, but there are definitely situations flipped in other ways
Oh yeah.
where men are asking, am I allowed to feel this? Am I
Of
allowed to
course.
express this?
Yeah.
I've been teaching a series of workshops on savoring the holidays and like letting yourself feel positive emotion. And one
Yeah.
of the biggest hurdles for men is that culturally there's a lot of subcultures in America where men are not allowed to feel joy, and they are not allowed to be playful other than in very specific contexts.
Yeah, you're right.
Right. And so it's just different, and in all of it's limiting, right? All of
Yeah.
it is unnecessarily limiting. But what I hear from you is you went from this place where like, I'm just trying to survive this. And, the depression is getting so heavy that I'm not doing it very well,
Yeah.
to the baby steps that led to a sense of growing well-being.
Mhm.
Spoiler alert, it wasn't just one marathon, right?
No, it was 20 and counting.
Which is impressive in its own way. Like we could do a whole episode just talking to you about like what's it like to run 20 marathons. But I want to take you back. I want to take you back to that moment that you're like in the first marathon. What did it feel like?
Well, I was a bundle of nerves at first because I was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing?
I felt that way the first time I did a triathlon. Yeah.
And I had done like 95% of my training on my treadmill, which is so crazy when you think of it, because it's just it does not translate the same to road running. But yeah, we traveled to Dallas and ran the Dallas, at the time it was called the Dallas White Rock Marathon. I think it's just Dallas Marathon now. But yeah, I ran that race and just left every single thing out there on the course. And I bawled like a baby when I crossed the finish line. I mean, it was just, I mean, I don't know if you've seen Spirit of the Marathon.
No.
It's like a 2007 documentary. It highlights different runners, but Dina Castor, who held like the women's US marathon record for years, is in it. And she says, sometimes the moments that challenge us the most define us. And that is really what I felt. Like I watched that movie a couple years later and I felt like I understood my really strong emotions better at the finish line, because it did feel like something changed. Like something changed, something happened inside me when I crossed the finish line, and I knew I just felt there's nothing I can't do. And so when you feel that, then you're like, okay, well, I want to test that out. Like, what else can I do?
More. Yeah.
Yeah.
More.
Yeah.
Big more.
And that, I knew right then, this is not my last one.
Yeah.
And I had
But you-
qualified. Oh, go ahead.
No, you go.
And that marathon, I ran a Boston Marathon qualifying time. And a couple of friends of mine who were also at the race were like, well, you've got to run Boston.
You gotta do Boston. If you qualified, go.
And I was like, well, I wasn't even thinking about that at all, and then I looked into it and I was like, okay, like I'll just do this. I'll just ask him, can I do one more? Because
Just one more.
so I'm like trying to sell him, like telling him Boston is the oldest running road race, and and it's prestigious, and like, I don't know. I was just listing all these reasons why this should be an exception. And again, he his first response was, you said that you were only going to do one. And I said, yeah, I know. I'm like, but it really means a lot to me. And he thought about it. And then our whole family packed up and went to Boston, and I did that. And then after that, I just told him, Kurt, this is a lifestyle.
Yeah, this is who I am now. Deal with it.
Yeah, and even by that second one, I had the courage to not ask, to say, I'm doing more of these.
And I can't help but think of, I'm sure you know now, but I wonder if you knew then, like the history of Catherine Switzer running
I did.
Boston and the men trying to pull her off the course. And for the listeners who don't know, she's recognized as the first woman to run Boston. And it was at a time that women were not allowed to run marathons. I believe, if I have the history correct, the theory was that if a woman tries to run a marathon, it will make her sterile. And just for context, her uterus would fall out, right?
Yeah,
it would fall out. And for context, this was in 1967. So it was not all that long ago that we were that poorly informed about women's athletics. Just hashtag said. But I think it's incredible that, the history of Boston, and that for you, it kind of became like a freedom race. What happened next? What happened since? Like, paint the picture for us. I know we're getting close to the end of our episode, but how did this unlock an evolution in you? Because it doesn't stop there.
No, it really did. I felt my own strength, and my own like power within. And I know all of that sounds really cliche, but it's true.
Not on this show.
I had never felt it before. I'm just like, wow, I'm capable of a lot more than I thought. And I think because the marathon is such a mentally grueling experience, which I feel like the mental part is harder than the physical part. I think just proving to myself I could do something really hard, I could persevere through it and see it through was really important for me. And at that time, I really think this triggered thought. Like, in the high control group, you really aren't encouraged to think critically or think outside the box. And that just allowed me in a way to start thinking of possibilities, like you said, the joy and the expansiveness. And I just felt free whenever I ran, and I almost just became addicted to it, where like I just felt like I had to run every day, except we couldn't run on Saturday.
Of course not.
Luckily, marathons are on Sunday. Most of them.
Yeah. But I can't help, my nerd brain can't help but throw in there that, like, running gives a massive spike to BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which causes a ton of neuroplasticity. So literally, like, your ability to think things you've never thought before increases. Sensitivity to your own serotonin. Myokines, which are another I'm going to get it wrong, neurotransmitter. I don't think that's right. Kelly McGonigal is going to slap me someday for getting myokines wrong. Like, there's all these physical things that happen that allow us to have the malleability to change. And you're doing it at, like, the highest scale of probably ultra marathons, but 20 marathons, I think, still counts back to back. I just think it's incredible. And so I really appreciate your willingness to share it, because, like you said, like, it sounds so hippy dippy that, like, running saved my life, but it's true. And my personal story, like, my scale is so much smaller because of my genetic condition. But I remember, like, I ran my first 5K after my diagnosis, and it took me 6 years to get there. And when I'm probably going to cry now talking about it, when I crossed the finish line, I started sobbing, just uncontrollably sobbing in this stupid little 5K in the West Village of Manhattan. And all these people are looking at me like I'm crazy. And I'm like, no, you don't understand what it means when you think that you have no options left and you claw your way back to something like that.
Yeah.
What it unlocks in you of, like, well, if I can do this and I thought I couldn't, what else can I do? And let me go figure that out, because it's way better than what I was doing before and what I was telling myself I couldn't. And I think it matters so much. So there's probably people who are listening to this, or who have heard your story in other forums, who think that they can't change, right? That it's not possible for them, either because someone else or their culture told them that they can't, or something has happened that has given them that internal dialogue. what would you say to them, or what do you say when people come to you with their stories?
I always just say that you're capable of more than you think you are. And, I don't know who said this first, but like other people's opinions of you are none of your business. And so it's like other people telling you can't do it or you don't have what it takes. Like they don't get to dictate that. And I know a lot of the problem is that we tell ourselves that, but those internal messages came from somewhere. Like we didn't create those. Someone else gave us that messaging, and so then we are doubting our own abilities. But I don't, when it comes to fitness goals or just body movement, I would just say start out small and see what happens. And whatever you decide to do, the actual like meat of it is in the process. Yeah, I had a transformative moment at the finish line, but that all was like that was all of my training was like leading me to that point. And I probably got more out of the training and the process of getting to the start line than I did just the moment I finished,
Yeah.
and so
And you were doing that training because you loved it, right? Like you
yeah,
loved
yeah.
running. And I think that's one of the things that I often find frustrating talking to practitioners. And maybe if I was going to give a direct message to any practitioners at this moment,
Mhm.
is it's all so much more effective if you help people find something that they like to do
Oh, yeah.
instead of that they have to do.
Yeah.
And oftentimes I find that if I can help a client find something that they like to do, they'll do all the have tos, like all the peripherals, especially my runners, right? Like I can
Mhm.
get them to resistance train if I tell them it will make them better at running.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even if they hate it, they'll do it
Mhm.
because they want to run so bad, right? Like,
Yes.
oh, you get to run when you're 80 if you do your corrective exercises twice a week.
Yeah.
Um, but it's got to start with the passion and the joy and the fun and the buzz and the feeling that it gives you in order
Yeah.
to fuel you to keep doing it indefinitely, and also in your case, like to completely change and evolve your life.
Yeah.
Um, what are you up to now? Where can people find you? I know you're still in transition because you're in school.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about where you're at and where we can find you.
Yeah. So, I did, I did exit the cult and that marriage, and that was a while back. And so now, all of my family stayed in the cult, and so I was estranged from everyone for 25 years.
Mm.
And just recently, my 4 siblings and their spouses and my mother exited, and we've all reunited. And so, my podcast, the Cult Next Door podcast, is a podcast with me and my youngest brother. And so, we're kind of exploring our experiences and our family dynamics. And then we talk to other people also, who have experienced high control groups in religion. And so I'm doing that. And then, like you mentioned, I'm in school because I want to be a clinical mental health counselor. And primarily, I would like to focus on helping people recover from being in high control groups, because I feel like that's what I know. Like I have experience with that. And so I feel like I can empathize maybe in a different way, just having gone through that and knowing how hard it is to um, process all of that. I'm still processing it,
Yeah. I feel like
but
it's not a one and done.
no, and it's so frustrating because sometimes I'm just like, for real, there's more.
I thought we
But
did this already. Well,
yeah,
and when I read that, because I didn't hear that in the original show, but I read it in your bio when you sent it over,
yeah,
and I got excited's the wrong word, but I am grateful for whoever in the future like needs you and has you in that future time someday. Um, because one of the wonderful things about getting to do the show is getting to interact with other really incredible and knowledgeable practitioners. And I always find that you go into this kind of work because there's a community that you want to be in service in that is very close to your heart. And
Right.
having heard interviews with you about this, and now hearing that that's what you want to do, like I'm getting emotional for you and for them, because it is in some ways a gift that some of the other communities I work with are, veterans and families of the fallen, and some of those people have gone into clinical practice, and that community to me has a saying around taking the worst things in your life that have ever happened to you and turning them into opportunities of service.
Absolutely.
That's been my journey through chronic illness and how it led me into everything I do now. And I hear that same truth in you. And that was part of why I wanted to have you on the show, because I think a lot of people in this space of helping, we come here because we needed help and we figured something out and we want to give it away. And so thank you for giving us a piece of it today, but also I'm proud of you for continuing to grow it forward. And if there's ever anything we can do to help you, let us know.
I will. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Where can we find you online? So you mentioned the show. Any socials we should know?
Yeah. I mean, we have the Cult Next Door podcast is online on Instagram and Facebook, TikTok. Yeah. And then my personal account is on there. Not much going on that except my kids. So probably the Cult Next Door would be the better place to go.
All right. We'll check it out. Thank you so much, Ashleigh.
Thank you.
And of course, we would love to hear from you. So if you've got any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, feelings, you be sure to reach out and let us know. You can email me. It's info@darlene.coach. You can find me on Instagram. That is also darlene.coach. And yes, that is my website as well. If you're a fan of the show, I hope that you've already subscribed. If you have, but you haven't written us a review, well, now is the time, my friends. Like, share, subscribe, rate it, do it. You know what to do. Thank you so much. Take good care of yourselves and be well.